y'all. Coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government, brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, Senior Consultant at Raftelis and GovLove co-host. We have a great episode for you today. We are talking sustainability and climate action in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. Engaging local government leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government, and your membership helps support this podcast. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Dr. Misty Stults is the Sustainability and Innovations Director at the City of Ann Arbor, Michigan, a position she's been in since 2018. Previously, she worked as a sustainability and climate consultant and as a climate director at ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. She has a PhD in urban resilience from the University of Michigan and a master's in climate and society from Columbia University. With that, Dr. Stults, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Ben.
Awesome. So we have a tradition on the podcast to do a lightning round to let our listeners get to know our guests a little better. So my first question for you is, what was the first concert that you went to?
I literally do not remember. The one I can remember is Skillet, believe it or not. Yeah, I know. Don't judge.
That's awesome. My first one is also embarrassing. It's Kenny Chesney. So, I mean.
Yes. Yes, it is. That's right.
All right. My next lighter question for you. What book are you currently reading?
Wow, I just drew a blank. It's not actually a book. It is the Inflation Reduction Act guide for local governments and looking to invest in their communities. So I'm reading a White House, 280-page document at the moment, literally. And then on the side, I've got a series of equity books that I'm working through right now. I always go back to things like white fragility to kind of ground myself.
That IRA document's got to be really, really nice right before bed, I imagine. Bedtime reading.
So stimulating. I barely sleep. Yeah.
All right. So my next lighter question for you. What was the last movie you saw in theaters or streamed?
Sing 2 with my daughter at her birthday party.
Awesome. What was your review?
I really like it, but sometimes you just need a total and complete break from the work that we do, and that was absolutely a total and complete break.
Perfect. That's awesome. Similarly, I think I recently watched Encanto for the same reason. I was just like, I can't deal with anything too serious right now. I just gotta turn something on.
How good that movie is. Okay,
yeah.
Let's create space for that and sit with it for a second. Encanto is great.
It is great. It was amazing. All right, so my last linear question for you. Where do you go for inspiration?
I actually go to the mountains when I need big time inspiration to kind of ground myself and get centered in the work. But of course, that's not every day. So when I need to really get inspiration and center myself, I tend to spend time walking the dog or just being outside broadly. I think the big open space creates an opportunity to think in big ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I can relate to that. Walking the dog helps me kind of start and end my day on a calming note, if nothing else. All right. So I was, close listeners to this pod will know that this is one of my favorite questions to ask, but I'm always curious about how folks got into their role in local government. There's not just one path into this field. And so, for you, what was your path into local government? How'd you kind of end up in the position you're in the city of Ann Arbor?
Thank you for the question. The truthful answer is circuitous. It wasn't a linear path. That I started working after school on climate issues in New York City at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, where I was doing some research. And I was lucky enough that one of the projects we got to take on was looking at New York City's water supply and how climate change would impact it. And it really teed up the importance of local and the impacts, the impacts from climate change. That's the most visceral at the local level. It's where they hit us and it's where we feel it. And then I went on actually to work at the international level for a little while, working on reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, or RED. And that was fascinating. And it was also slow going. And I learned how important that work is, but how it doesn't align with the speed and pace that I move, as probably evidenced by the fact I talk really fast. So I learned a lot and was thankful for it and moved out of that, went to nonprofit. And in the nonprofit role at ICLEI, I got to work with local governments around the country and indigenous populations on their own climate work. And I fell in love with local work at that level. I really appreciated being at the 30,000 foot view, where I was never actually the one doing the work, but I was able to help places like New York City or Ann Arbor or LA or Lewis, Delaware advance their work. and then decided to go do a short stint in the private sector. I learned private sector is not for me. I'm very mission driven and purpose driven, but I needed that, sort of like dating. You got to try all these different things to see what works. And then I got an opportunity to work on the U.S. National Climate Assessment because they needed someone to tell stories of what local governments were doing. And the vantage I had working with, over 1,000 local governments gave me a very unique perspective of what was happening. And at the same time, they said, they didn't actually say it in this way, but here's like the summary. Effectively, they were like, we really want someone who has a PhD to do this work. And I was like, well, then they said, well, but we also want you. So how about you do a PhD and do this at the same time? And I was like, nah, okay, game on. So I did. And then went to the University of Michigan. I'm almost done, I promise. Did my PhD, was planning to go to the federal government, actually in a Clinton administration, which we know did not happen. Was really excited to kind of, put pedal to the metal there and push local perspectives from inside the federal government. But then I got an opportunity in Ann Arbor, where I was living, where I had started a family and that I love, and the city was starting its first sustainability office, and was asked to step up and push that work forward. And I thought, yeah, absolutely. So here I am, not a straight path.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. So I'm curious, I know as a consultant for local governments, it's kind of a unique perspective on the industry, and especially for you, where you're working on a specific topic like climate action. So, what were some, I don't know, takeaways or themes from kind of your consultant work where you got to work with a bunch of different communities on this issue? Or were there things that you're like, oh man, if I ever get the chance to run an office like the one you're running in Ann Arbor, these are the things that I would want to focus on? Or I'm just curious about kind of your takeaways from that time.
Yeah, good question. Well, I think there's sort of two takeaways. There's the one of what I learned about the kind of consultant I would want to be, and then what I learned about how I would want to do the work. And so to the consultant I would want to be, I've only ever really worked with mission-driven consulting firms, because I really want to build the capacity of communities to continue doing this work. Right? It's not about coming in and helping someone get a really shiny plan that they can't implement because you've never built the capacity or the support or the institutional structures to succeed. So I've always been looking at places that there was a broader purpose and mission behind the work. That's been really critical. What I also learned from that perspective, that was part of the reason I took the position in Ann Arbor, is the importance of having, I'm trying to think of how I would name this. I'll say there's 4 things broadly that really matter if you want to see transformative change. You've got to have staff. You've got to have internal buy-in from management. You've got to have political leadership on the issues, and you've got to have community support. And then when those things happen, you start to get the other things. You have your capacity, you start to get financial resources to move. But if any one of those pillars is out, the work does tend to struggle a little bit. It's harder to move it forward. And Ann Arbor had all 4 of them. And so for me, I saw a strategic opportunity to sprint at what the science tells us we have to do around climate change. And that was a gift that was just too great to let pass.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. So I imagine you're in your role as a consultant, you probably were helping communities that didn't have all 4 of those pillars kind of. So, I mean, if, for maybe listeners that are in a place like that, where they've got, 2, 3, 1 of those things, like how did you kind of help them, or what could they do to kind of bring those last pieces around?
Yeah. I am a social scientist by training, so I'm going to say it depends on the context, which everyone hates hearing, but it does, right? So in some cases, it's really helping find language, because the values in many communities are the same. People want healthy air and healthy water. They want to know that their kids are breathing non-toxic fumes, right? When they're cooking, they want to make sure there's high quality of life for people in a place. But the language we use can either bring people into that conversation and help them be part of the solution, or it can exclude them from that. And so we would work on language with some places about how we frame this work. One example I think about is some funding I did, or some resources we got from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to work in the West with Adaptation International and Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. And we were trying to understand when weather went from being a nuisance to a real problem. And so we sat around a room in, a community in which climate change was only ever uttered by the person, the direct liaison we had. That was not something we could talk about publicly. But we could talk about flooding, and we could talk about how much rain in a 24-hour period overwhelmed the riverbed and caused, pretty significant impacts. And everyone had a story and everyone had expertise to bring to that conversation. And so we were able then to say, okay, well, we know that you've had that much rainfall 10 times in the last 20 years. What if it happens 20 times in the next 10? And we knew that that was a likely outcome based on climate models and climate projections. And people would say, we can't handle that. And then we got to solutions about it. But we didn't have to talk about climate change, but we were doing climate change work.
Yeah,
that's just an example.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. We're obviously going to talk more about kind of Ann Arbor and some of the specific things you and your team are doing, but I'm curious, I was struck by, as I was reviewing the A20 climate action plan, like how far some of this work has gone at the local level, like how far things have come even in the last, 4 or 5 years. What's your kind of perspective on how far, how much more maybe local action there is kind of happening compared to maybe when you started your career as either a consultant or working with the federal government to kind of now what the amount of actions happening, in cities and communities. What's your kind of thought on how far that's kind of come?
Yeah, I'm going to put a caveat that I have discovered I'm a localist. And so that frames a lot of the way I think about this work. But climate action has always happened at the local level. Climate leadership has come from the local level. It's come from our Indigenous and tribal leaders. It's come from our mayors and council members and city administrators across the board. That is where we don't have a choice, right? The impacts of climate change do not respect geopolitical boundaries. We're the ones who have to deal with the flooding or the heat wave. We're the ones working to protect the public health, safety, and general welfare. And so this work is really important at the local level. And we've always seen locals lead. We've seen states and the federal government and the international community follow that leadership. And so I think what we're seeing is both more local leadership, but we're actually starting to pay attention to the leadership that's actually been there for 2 decades in many places, and in some other places, just starting to emerge. But I think local governments have been leading on this issue the entire time. Yeah.
No, well said. Cool. So maybe for our listeners that haven't been to Ann Arbor before, can you touch a little bit on kind of tell us a little bit about the community and then maybe some of the unique, climate and sustainability challenges that y'all deal with?
Yeah, Ann Arbor is an extraordinary community. So if you haven't been here, I cannot wait to welcome you. It is a community of just over 120,000 people. We are home to the University of Michigan. We are the county seat for Washtenaw County in southeastern Michigan, about 50 minutes from Detroit, for those who need a little centering. We are a diverse community, but we are a community that has, like every community in America, a history of segregation and putting up systemic barriers and obstacles to almost everything that we're talking about. And that'll become relevant in a moment when I talk about our sustainability and equity work in the community. We are home. We have the highest per capita rate of PhDs. So we're the most educated community in America, which is very exciting and great.
Yeah.
Let's see. We have 170 parks. We're 25 square miles, 5 by 5. So that's just a little bit of kind of the geography. Highly walkable place. We have really high commuting by biking and walking in the community. Great public transit system. I don't know that this is true, but I say it hoping that it is. I think we have the highest adoption rate of electric vehicles in the state of Michigan.
Oh, wow.
I want that to be true.
Yeah.
So I'm going to keep saying
you can will it into the world. Yeah.
I'm going to will that into the world. So, and we have a history of being kind of a leader in this work. The city formed an energy advisory committee in 1981 to start thinking about how to start preserving energy. Shortly thereafter, hired their first staff of centering environmental, kind of more traditional environmental. Sure, energy was involved, but think like environmental contamination and remediation work. And this person grew over time to really start pushing a lot of climate initiatives. There's specifics I can share if it's useful about like the timeline of this work. We adopted our first climate action plan in 2012. The adoption of that plan at that time, which both is not a long time ago, but also is, especially from a science perspective. The city set the goal of a 90% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We now know, obviously, that's not sufficient. But at the time, the, kind of du jour goal was an 80% reduction by 2050. So the city even said we need to go further than our peers. Like, we know we are an affluent community, and it's our responsibility to push on that and use that affluence and that, incredible intellectual power that we have to do better, to be better in that space. So fast forward, I don't know, do you want me to go to A20 and how we got there?
Yeah. I assume that's kind of the document that guides your work. So I'm curious to hear more about it and kind of the pieces that make up that plan.
Yeah, for sure. So A20 actually emerged from, in 2019, we had a group of residents who were pushing an emergency, a climate emergency declaration. And these have been sweeping across the country, largely in Europe and Australia. And at the time, they really wanted our elected leaders to pass and declare that climate change was an emergency and required that we act like it was an emergency. And in talking with those residents and really understanding where they were coming from, realized that there was an opportunity to do more than just declare an emergency, but to actually put a plan in place and dedicate resources to respond to that emergency. So they brought forward a resolution with staff support that we kind of co-created. City Council took up that resolution in November of 2019, and on the floor passed it unanimously and said, we are going to set a new goal that as a community, we're going to be carbon neutral in a just and equitable way by 2030. And you have 4 months to figure out how. Go. So, there's some sweating.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, no one has done this, but here we go. Which actually is probably one of the greatest gifts the City Council gave us, because it meant from the very beginning, we accepted that certainty wasn't going to be possible. That, no one has done this, and we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for action. So we formed a coalition. It's called our A20 Collaborators Network. At the time, it was about 60 organizations. Today, it's about 120 organizations. We pulled them together and we said, if we're going to do this, we're going to need you. We're going to need your membership. We're going to need your voice. We've got to hear your various perspectives. So we pulled together this collaborative network. We pulled together technical advisory committees. We did public engagement and outreach, and we ran. And we came up with A20. And there's more. Our website has a lot more details about our processes. We try to be super transparent about our decision-making frameworks. But we presented to City Council A20 in April. They wanted to bring it up for Earth Day for consideration. And I'm not going to pretend that it was all roses and like a love fest, because it was hard. I mean, to hit that goal are a lot of things that are really challenging that we've got to take on. And City Council, received that and struggled with the ambition and then the realities of bringing that ambition to the fore. So they asked us to go back and do a little bit more analysis and work. We did. And on June 1st, technically June 2nd, because it was like 2 a.m. in the morning, we presented A20, the revised plan, as well as a investment scenario, because we were really transparent that this is not free, but also we're going to pay for climate change one way or another. We're either going to invest in our future and our community, or we're going to pay for the impacts. And so we presented an investment scenario, very transparently outlining the cost. We did a prioritization framework so that they understood how the actions got in there. And if they wanted to recommend others, they had to understand the criteria by which we were evaluating things. And then we brought a governance framework, and they adopted it unanimously on the floor.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah. And we'll be sure to link to the plan. I think you've got like a whole webpage on the city's website with like all sorts of resources. So we'll be sure to link to that in the show notes. So I'm curious to kind of go back to the formation piece, the network. Were those, can you talk about who were the folks that you brought to the table? Were these, academics, researchers, like nonprofits? What were those folks that were kind of involved in the creating of the plan?
All of the above.
Yeah.
So it depends on which tentacle you want to kind of unpack, but I'll say public engagement. We had, we estimate 1 in every 9 Ann Arborites gave us feedback into the plan.
Wow.
We ran large public surveys. We ran 68 public events in 80 days, because that's what we had. And for those who, haven't yet made the connection, we finished the plan as the pandemic hit. Right. So we ended up having to cancel our final public engagement events because we went into lockdown. So we had a lot more scheduled. And the only way those kinds of engagement events were possible is because we worked with those collaborators. So we said, and to your question, whether that was the biking and walking, community, we said, okay, we want to meet with you and we want to hear your priorities. And we went and worked with our housing commission, our affordable housing partners. And we said, we need to make sure that we're thinking about housing and affordability in this conversation. We went to our landlords and we said, how do you want to see this represented? And all of these organizations stepped up to be part of the work. We have businesses that are now part of the coalition, nonprofits for sure, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor Public Schools, our district library, our major institutions, as well as those who care in some way, shape, or form about this topic. We extended an invitation and said, I doubt anyone is going to love everything we have to do.
Yeah.
But there's probably something here that aligns with you and your work and your values. And let's focus on that and work together to advance it. And also, even if you may not like some of the initiatives, we still want your perspective on those initiatives so we can have as robust of a conversation and get to a conclusion as authentically and meaningfully as we can.
Wow. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's fascinating. That's a lot of people to bring to the table and corral. That's
I don't know that we do it well. I would say, you have not asked me this, but the collaborators network still exists. And it's one of the things that's a priority for our next year is to really nurture it and love it, because there is so much potential in working with these collaborators. We just need to unlock it.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. And when you presented the draft plan to council, what were some of the things that maybe changed between that draft version and the 2 a.m. adopted version?
It was one thing, 2 actions, one thing, and it was about land use. So we had strategies in there that would let by right in any area of the city, you could build duplexes, triplexes, or quads. And that was a really hard thing for the community to take on, for council members to sit with. It was tough, and it is land use is really challenging, right? Because land use, I think I've said visceral before, but land use is visceral, right? It's what you see and how you experience your community. And the compromise we had to make was removing that from the plan. And instead, we're about to update our comprehensive land use plan. And we're taking that conversation back up now.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's very visceral. At the same time, it's the biggest lever, I would argue, that local governments have to deal with sustainability and affordability, all of the above.
I mean, to give you a sense of how truly impactful that was, good or bad, one of my neighbors who did not know who I was going door to door as we were working through this process and dropped off a flyer at my house that told residents to come out in opposition to A20 because it would take away their property values. It would distract from them. It would take away our wonderful neighborhoods, right? And I remember walking after her and saying, I don't want this rubbish. This isn't true. This isn't how this works. And I'm really sorry that you think you want to spread this false narrative. But it was that visceral that people perceived those actions in that way.
Wow. Oh, I'm excited for you to have that community conversation again now.
I have very soft views, so I don't think anyone will know where I stand on these issues.
Yeah, no way. So I think I remember when I reviewed the plan, just kind of skimming through it in prep for this interview. I think there were 6 or 7 strategies that were kind of the high level things that made up the plan. I don't know, do you want to highlight any of those just to kind of give our listeners maybe a sense of kind of the things that you guys centered on that were the core pieces of the plan?
Yeah, so we had 7 strategies and 44 actions. The strategies I define it as the foundation, and those are pretty immovable. Almost in many communities, these are the things you have to do. The actions are how you bring those to life, and those will change, right? Those naturally will evolve. So we tend to center on the strategies, and the 7 strategies are: we've got to power our electric grid with 100% renewable energy. We have number 2, we have to transition away from diesel, propane, natural gas, gasoline to electric, because we cannot make those clean, but we can make electric clean. 3rd is we have to invest in deep energy efficiency work, energy waste reduction. What's different here is you can't just start there. Because of our timeline and because of the urgency of the crisis, we have to do those first 3 actions in tandem. So a lot of our solutions focus on integrating those 3 things. The 4th is we have to reduce the miles we travel in our vehicles by 50%. That's a land use strategy largely. The 5th is we have to move towards a more circular economy, getting away from viewing things, even and people, truthfully, as disposable to having a much more relational kind of interaction with the materials and the people that we have in our life, keeping them in productive use. The sixth is that we have to invest in the resilience of our people in our place because climate change is already here. We're already experiencing it. And then the seventh is other. They're actions that don't belong in any category because they belong in every category. So community engagement, transparency, metrics reporting, our equity work. And then, of course, we have I shouldn't say, of course, we have a grant program that we run because, of course, we miss things. So we actually give out up to $10,000 grants. We have $100,000 allocated for residents to bring forward ideas that we forgot.
Cool. Very cool. That's awesome. Well, and I know the electrical grid one stood out to me. I know that's kind of when you hear folks talk about, these issues nationally, that's like the big strategy is moving appliances into electrical and then shifting the grid. But I've always kind of struggled with, a lot of cities don't have control. They're not often the electric utility provider. And so there's not a lot of direct control that local governments can have over some of that. So I'm curious how you guys are navigating that. Cause I think that's the case in Ann Arbor, right? That the city is not the utility provider for electricity. So how are you guys kind of navigating that?
Yeah, we have an investor owned utility and our franchise was generally perceived as in perpetuity. Franchise. So you often hear about places that like compete for their franchise, so they get franchise fees. That's not in play for Ann Arbor, but it might be in play for other listeners. And I would strongly recommend taking a look if you've got that kind of lever, how you can pull it. For us, we have to create, and we are working on multiple different approaches, right? There is not just one magical fix to this. So we do things like run a Solarize program, but our Solarize program is a little bit different than the DOE's program. It's sort of like a Tupperware party, if people are familiar with those, where folks come together. Someone decides that they want to invest in solar. They invite their friends. They invite their solar installer. The city comes. We have a staff person who helps support this, and they all get discounts based on the volume that sign up for solar. And it's more nuanced than that, but we have a toolkit. It's bonkers successful. I mean, our solar adoption curve is glorious. We've got about 3 megawatts of solar, residential solar, right? So we're talking like 7 kW systems, 3 megawatts of solar installed in 3 years. That's a lot of residential solar for a community like Ann Arbor. We also we intervene regularly in regulatory cases, rate cases, trying to push our utility to go faster, further, deeper in terms of their decarbonization work. We collaborate with them where we can. We're working on the nation's largest landfill solar project. It has hit some hiccups due to inflation and supply chain issues, but we've got it designed and we're just trying to close that gap. And then we're exploring the creation of a sustainable energy utility, which would be a supplemental utility to our investor-owned utility. And it would not focus on kind of what we might think of as traditional municipalization. I do not have a desire to move traditional municipalization forward and buy an old antiquated grid infrastructure. I think the infrastructure that we have right now is the infrastructure of the past. It fails us. It's incredibly vulnerable. It's too centralized. And instead, we are proposing primarily focusing on generation. So a sustainable energy utility, I'm happy to talk about it more, but focuses on the city standing up a supplemental utility, doesn't replace the utility, but it comes in and provides a lot of the power through solar, eventually geothermal, small scale wind where we can, and helps everyone have access to clean energy because at the end of the day, the goal is not owning distribution. The goal is owning generation.
Yeah, no, I think I read that. You guys might have a page on your website about the sustainable electric utility or something. But I was really interested in that. So what does that mean exactly? You're setting up maybe a parallel electric utility, or using the same infrastructure, and we're just deciding hey, we want more sustainable sources, or what? Yeah, what does that mean?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Okay, so the way I'm going to go backwards and go forwards. Historically, if you wanted to set up a supplemental utility, you had to stand up all that parallel infrastructure. So imagine looking out your window and you've got your investor-owned utilities, power lines, and the poles right across the street. But on your side of the street, you've got this other utility that's got all these poles and these wires, because that's how the system had to work.
Yeah.
Well, not true anymore. With advancements in distributed energy resources and storage, what we can actually do is set up a supplemental utility that its first phase has no lines and power. Power lines or poles. You still have that investor-owned utility, but on your roof, you have solar, and in your back, you have storage. So you're a behind-the-meter solar and storage system that provides your power first in, first out, and then anything else you need, you're pulling from the big grid, the traditional kind of grid itself. That means you have a more resilient power supply, because when that big grid goes down, and you bet it will, we still have solar and storage that's powering your critical loads. So what's true in this case is our utility doesn't appear to want us to push any power to the grid. So it is disconnected from the grid. So you're not going to sell it back. So we need to maximize the amount that you actually use on site. That's phase one. Phase two is you start to get a density. My neighbor, myself, 2 other households, we all have solar and storage, or maybe one of us can't get solar because we have beautiful trees. How about we nanogrid? So now we're actually sharing power amongst all of us so that when I don't need it, but I'm generating because I do have solar on my roof, I can push it to my neighbor. They're using it. We're all only paying per kilowatt hour of usage. And our preliminary analysis shows that it's actually going to be cost parity, if not cheaper, than what you pay the investor-owned utility, because we can, one, solar and storage, like we can amortize that as a local government over longer periods. We don't have shareholders that we have to pay a profit to. Our shareholders are the public. And because we can get money cheaper as a government just based on our bond ratings. So that's what we're proposing.
That's so cool. And so that second phase is kind of like, I think, the federal government put out some sort of graphics around like a virtual
grid resilience.
Yeah. And they have like virtual power plants. So that's kind of, I think, the same thing, or I can't remember what they called it, but anyway.
I might have a proposal that I'm working on.
Yeah.
Related to that.
But so would that, to connect the kind of nano grid that you're talking about, where, hey, everybody on my street has solar and battery storage, if we connect each other, we'd be more resilient, and be able to support the folks that maybe couldn't afford or didn't have space for solar. Would that require parallel lines, or could you use the investor-owned utility connections to kind of feed that, or how would that work?
We're modeling standing up our own very limited lines, to connect to that system, because that will be the highest cost. But if the utility actually lets us push back, then that would actually be less. So we want to make sure economically it works if we can't, if we have to stand up parallel lines. So that's a part of the proposal that we're actually putting in through the group, is to explore this. And I would say the other value is there's incredible value to the big G grid, right? Yeah. That if we have all these DERs on the system and the storage, that can be used to help deal with the resilience of the traditional grid. Those are assets that can be pulled on at times where we have outages, kind of move throughout the system. It also means a place like Ann Arbor is electrifying fast. So costly grid upgrades are going to be necessary to handle that electrification, but not if we do it in this way. If we start deploying DERs in our system, distributed energy resources and storage, we can mitigate that increased demand by generating it ourselves. And those are local jobs. I can't outsource those jobs. I need local electricians in my community. I need HVAC people in my community when I'm doing geothermal systems. So we're really excited about what this means for job creation, for the resilience of our people, for the reliability of our power grid, and from equity. Because you no longer in the system do you have to have $20,000, $15,000 to buy a solar system. You just got to pay your bill.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's fascinating. So even if the electric utility is not like a willing partner, you can set these kind of things up where your grid is more resilient because there's less folks pulling on, or you're reducing the demand for electric service because of these alternative sources. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and hopefully they see the value of it. Even though they're not ready to jump in today, maybe we can demonstrate what's possible, and we actually pivot our utility, which means we help people all over their network get the benefit of this kind of thinking.
Yeah, very cool. All right, so switch gears a little bit here, but I think you might have referenced this earlier, but one of the values of the A20 plan was or is equity. And so how does equity get incorporated in this? I know you've touched on this a little bit, but I'm just curious to hear you talk more explicitly about how does equity kind of get incorporated into some of your actions or the way you guys are implementing the A20 plan?
Transparently, every day, and incompletely. And that's more of like the framing, just to kind of set up where I'm going to go. Equity can't be optional for this work. And I'd say sometimes I think the nomenclature in certain fields has evolved, but equity is not a lens. I mean, you can't have the privilege of taking it off, right? Like I wear glasses, and so like I can take off my glasses and choose not to see what's in front of me. But if we're really serious about this work, we must always face the fact that we have disproportionate impacts in our community. We have disproportionate stories, institutional structures that have let some of us in and kept some of us out of economic opportunities, of honestly, health benefits. We're seeing more and more about like the health ramifications of the legacy of our racist kind of system and structures. So for us, if we're really serious about it, it means we always have to talk about it. We always have to create space to call each other in and out to these conversations. And then we try to center equity in our work by doing things like working in the Bryant neighborhood of Ann Arbor, which is in the southeastern portion of our city. It is our largest concentration of low-income and BIPOC residents. It's a 262 household neighborhood built by the same developer. There's only 2 styles of houses. And for 2 years, we've been meeting with the residents and one of our community-based organizations, Community Action Network, to figure out what does that community want as we're moving forward? What do they need as we're moving A20 forward? How do they want to be centered in this work? And a goal was named that they want to be the most sustainable and first decarbonized low-income neighborhood in America. So we're working to make that happen. We hold events with them. We hire, we fundraise, and we hire staff from that neighborhood to do community engagement and outreach. Money goes to Community Action Network because they're centered in the neighborhood. We have just won our first implementation grant. So we are taking 19 homes as far as we can towards full decarbonization. The residents have designed a decarbonization strategy, and I wouldn't use the word decarbonization, right? Like I'm using that here. For them, it's this assessment that's all things. It's sure a traditional energy assessment, but it's also looking at renewable energy potential and radon exposure and indoor air quality and where there's opportunity for food generation on site and stormwater retention. And so we're administering that for free for residents to understand what the needs are. And then we're actively fundraising to fill those gaps.
Interesting. That's so cool. So, this kind of leads into my next question. So a lot of like the actions in the plan require getting folks to maybe change, the appliances in their home, invest in solar, do things that, that the local government doesn't have direct control over, but you can kind of encourage them to change their behaviors. So how are you guys doing? I mean, maybe it's a 2-part question. How are you engaging the community just generally as part of this work? And then how are you guys helping to like bring people along to like adopt some of these strategies and kind of help achieve the actions and the strategies you have in your plan?
Excellent question. To the first part, I would say community engagement. We have a yes and approach. When people ask us to come and talk to them about these issues, we say yes. And we try to figure out how we align with what they want to see advanced, because we're going to see more success, right, if it aligns with their values and their goals. We do at least 2 community engagement events a month. Mostly, truthfully, in almost every month, it's like once a week. And during A20 week, which is a week-long celebration of what the community is doing around A20, we run like 28, 30 events in the course of a week where we're just celebrating. We're not trying to draw attention to necessarily the city, but we're drawing attention to the restaurants that are part of the sustainable food movement, or our nonprofits that are pushing hard and fast and getting people to use alternative transit or to walk and bike more. So we really try to elevate the people that are doing this work, giving them the respect and the attention that they need, because there are so many people doing this work. And in doing that, you normalize it, right? People start to see people they know doing it, and it's not as scary or intimidating. Yeah. The second piece, though, is hard, right? I'm going to go on a slight tirade and say I have a pet peeve when people try to shame individuals. That's not going to fix this problem, right? I went to a behavior change conference, and the very first thing the speaker said was, shame on all of us for getting on an airplane. I was like, I'm not interested in that. Yeah. I didn't create this problem, Ben. You didn't create this problem. We are not the actual problem. And me decarbonizing my home, which I'm actively working on, is not going to solve the climate crisis. Yes, it is an important piece of this work to demonstrate what's possible, to move the markets. But we need to pay a lot of attention to systemic systems change work. We need to hold polluters accountable. We need to make sure that our money is investing in the kinds of things that we care about, the values that we hold. It's really trying to help point attention to the actual arbiters of this problem, who need to be the ones finding the solutions. So I just put that out there to say we have to work on a lot of individual behavior change as well as collective behavior change, but that by itself does not solve this. Right? Yeah. We have to talk about who's really to blame, and we need to stop shaming each other. There's no holier than thou in this movement. So that's just like my soapbox moment. To behavior change, though. Yeah. I'm delighted to share that in November, our residents passed a community climate action millage. I think we become the 6th or the 7th community in America to tax ourselves to fund climate work. And one of the very clear things we're going to be doing is passing rebates and incentives on to residents to make these changes. So we'll stack them with the Inflation Reduction Act and any support from the state. And we are going to help make this as easy as possible for people to make the kinds of changes, or to at least make better choices when they have an opportunity to decide what to put in their home, what to cook with, you name it.
That's awesome. No, I can't wait to talk more about the climate action millage, but because I think that's so cool. But before we move on from kind of engaging with folks, I've worked, in a college town, and we've worked with several in my current role. And often the university can be kind of the big gorilla in the room, and they can be a willing partner, or sometimes they can kind of impede some of the work that the city might be trying to do. So I'm just curious, how do you guys kind of work with the University of Michigan? What's kind of the collaboration on these issues specifically with them?
I think we are so blessed to have the University of Michigan and also Washtenaw Community College, Concordia University right around us. Mm-hmm. I would say, like any relationship, it is multi-pronged, and both of us have responsibility for making sure we continue to nurture that relationship and grow it. But we have, the students that we get to work with are so passionate and engaged. The faculty members, we do faculty projects. We often come in and speak to classes. We hire students, from the community to come in. Many of them end up transitioning into the office over time. Mm-hmm. We've worked really hard with the university, and we have a lot of work to do with the university on making sure that students see themselves as part of the community and not just part of campus. While they're here, be part mm-hmm. of here and be part mm-hmm. of the movement. You're in Ann Arbor, right? For the time you're in Ann Arbor. So let's, how do we help them see that? Mm. And then we're working on our very first joint procurement process, actually. Cool. We're both looking to advance renewable energy. And while we're going to put out separate requests for proposals, we're going to use the same language and indicate that we're hoping firms will bid on both of ours so that we can move together and really deploying a very visible demonstration of our commitment to decarbonization.
That's fascinating. That's really cool. Well, I know universities are often as, or even more bureaucratic than local governments can be.
You said it, not me, Ben.
So finding partners, I think, is almost the hardest part. Is like, what's the right office and the right people to have at the table. Well,
and trust, right? Like in mm-hmm. any relationship, we've all learned that they move at the speed of trust, mm-hmm. and so you've really got to work hard to maintain open lines of communication and to believe that when we say things, we're going to do things.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned the climate action millage. So I'm curious, you've obviously been with the city since 2018. So you saw kind of this conversation come about and then the passing. So what kind of led to being like, we need a dedicated portion of the tax rate for this. And then, and then I want to talk more about kind of what the funding will be used for, but I'm just curious about how that kind of conversation started and how you guys then kind of pitched it to the community.
Yeah. One of the fascinating things that I bet everyone knows that's listening to this is we rarely have time to kind of reflect on how we got to where we got. Mm. And recently I started to think about this question, like, how did we get here where we passed a tax with 71% of the vote? Like, how did we even get to getting on the ballot? And so I have some more deep thinking to do to reconstruct that. But here's what I think is true. The community has had a lot of goals and a lot of policy statements around climate action, but there had never been dedicated funding. In 2018, the city found a little bit of funding and started to allocate resources to climate work. And it started to matter. And then with A20, I think it was really important, even though it was very hard, to release that investment plan. So we showed the cost.
Yeah.
To take action and the benefit of taking action. And by being really open and transparent about that, we set the stage that we have to allocate resources to do this. This doesn't just like, you don't wish it and will it. You have to be serious. And I think that, as I mentioned before, that was not easy. That was very complicated mm-hmm. and hard for staff and council to take on. But it allowed us to get to this point where then every time we came, we were really clear about the cost.
Yeah. Sorry. That's fascinating. Cause I think, organizations I've been in or worked with, you would almost want to, the thought would be to err on the side of what can we actually afford to do and put that in the plan rather than let's put everything and the total, everything that we actually need, and show the actual total cost, because of the worry about like, where are we going to find the money? Like So
Totally
that's
fine approach.
fascinating. That it
I
almost
mean,
helped you start that conversation with like, well, we are going to have to figure out how to fund this.
yeah, and that's a very fair approach. And you're right. Like most organizations do that. I would say I have also learned in self-reflection that that is not the kind of leader that I am, that
Mm,
I tend to err on the one, science. The science is super clear what we have to do.
yeah.
And two, the other side is I believe that you have to inspire people. I believe that you have to give them something to hope for and to want to be a part of to get to action. That does not negate any other type of leadership. It is
Mhm.
just what I was going to bring to this conversation. And if the city needed to go in a different direction, I am not the person to lead that direction.
Mm. Hmm. All right, then I think you've mentioned some of the things that you guys are planning to use the funding for, but are there other examples you want to highlight or share, or programs that will be possible now that you've got this millage that weren't before?
Yeah. So this is a really timely question that we're in the budgeting process. So I have
Yeah.
drafted the budget of how I intend to use the millage, and City Council has not yet approved that. But I will say we do have a millage website, and I'm keeping really high fidelity to what we told the voters we would do. That's
Hmm.
appropriate, right?
Hmm.
So it's things like investing in year-round composting and year-round recycling, especially for multi-family apartment dwellers
Mm.
and for commercial businesses, because single-family homes have those benefits, right? So we need to extend them to everyone else. And that generally is not a high greenhouse gas emission reduction activity, but it is a gateway. It's very personal, right? Every person can be a part of this by participating in what they use and how they use it. It's investments in neighborhood swap days, and we have a returnable container program that we've been piloting with a handful of restaurants during the pandemic. We want to expand that so every restaurant has these returnable containers. So we're eliminating as much plastic and styrofoam as we can in the system.
Hmm.
It is direct rebates for incentives for investing in things like solar or electrical panel upgrades. And we're stacking those with the Inflation Reduction Act so they can go further, faster for folks. We are investing in resilience hubs. We have our second and our third resilience hub in motion. We do have our first, and this funding will help us kind of, drastically move those forward, which I'm really excited about. Oh my goodness. We have biking infrastructure. We're working over the next 5 years on 20 additional miles of bike lanes in the community. We're doing lighting replacements. We're transitioning our vehicles. We've ordered our first 2 electric refuse trucks, and we're working to bring 4 to 5 more into the system. Working on one of the Bryant neighborhood, of course. Another one of my favorite projects is we have an affordable housing commission, and we're working with them to make sure every housing commission site is net zero energy.
Hmm.
Again, lines with our goals and our values. They should have low operating costs so they can provide more of those critical services and more housing for people in need. So those are just some of the things that'll be advanced.
That's so cool. That's awesome. And yeah, we'll be sure to link to your Climate Action Millage website so folks can check that out too. Um, last couple questions for you. So I'm curious how, you're, the Office of Sustainability and Innovations, but like often, some of the actions that are in this plan or that you want to, like bike lanes, for example, like you're going to need to work with other departments to get those done and those planned out and those installed. So how do you guys collaborate with other departments within the city? So what's that, relationship with transportation or public works or any other department to kind of bring them along with some of these action items?
I am so lucky to work in an organization with some world-class public servants. Like, there's just no doubt about that. I also think the answer is somewhat similar to working with the University of Michigan. It's about trust. It's about understanding their goals, the tasks that they've been asked to advance by our council, our policymakers, and figuring out where we have strategic alignment. So I would say I love our transportation manager. I think he is probably one of the best, if not the best, transportation manager in the country. And it's sitting down and understanding he has this goal around vision zero traffic fatalities. Well, I have a goal around zero emissions. So why don't we combine them? And let's figure out how we do that by slowing vehicles down, by getting people to walk and bike more, by making sure we have well-lit sidewalks, crosswalks, intersections, and by investing in electrification for those vehicles that we have to go. And so, we sit down and we talk about shared values and objectives. And it's about showing up at his events to say, yeah, bike lanes do matter. And let's talk about that connection to climate. It's working with the fire chief to create Michigan's first net zero energy fire station and figuring out how we do that. We're looking at electric fire trucks. They're not quite ready for our use, but they're coming. And so we're watching them closely. It's working with our housing commission partners, right? Like I talked about before, that their goal is to have a safe environment for people to live, to be housed. And if I can help them do that by bringing some money to the table, and by the way, the investments that we're making lower their operating costs, that's a win-win. So, some of this is about finding collaboration and partnership. And honestly, some of this is being a hammer. It's coming in and saying, listen, council adopted this. You may not want to, but we have to. So what are we going to do? And I'm lucky enough to be on the executive team of the city where I can have those conversations.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That, like, first of all, having that shared goal where, like, hey, we can achieve this, our two things together. Because I think often especially operational departments, like, with public works, like, they're so overwhelmed with maintaining streets that, they don't have time to think about some of these, broader strategic things. And so finding those shared goals, I think that's such a great strategy. And then being the hammer probably helps too.
I did play college basketball and my nickname was the Hammer. So
that's awesome. That's great. Cool. So, what's kind of next? What else? What are you guys working on that we haven't got to talk about yet, or that our listeners should look out for that's coming out in the next, I don't know, month, year, or whatever?
Oh my gosh, I love this. I'm so overwhelmed by this question. I don't know where to start. Let's see. Well, of course, we're gearing up for the Community Climate Action millage dollars. So those will hit our bank account for the very first time, July 1st. So there's a lot of work in setting up the systems, kind of learning from our peers, especially our peers in Denver who have a similar tax, and understanding, like, how did they set this up? How effective is it? What would they change? So there's a lot of peer learning there. We do have a proposal that we're exploring to ban all new natural gas connections in the community. So that is eating up a small amount of time, as I'm sure you can imagine.
Yeah.
The sustainable energy utility and the fundraising we're doing there, if we're successful, we will operationalize that and start to see that move forward. And I'm working on, many, 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 many other exciting things, like an energy concierge and a low-income sustainability grant program and fun things. But I think I want to end with climate migration is a topic that I've been thinking about for a long time and working with some national peers and fellow researchers on. But we're going to have some work to really understand what people movement throughout the US is going to look like and mean for the kinds of work that we're doing. And I think we'll be spending some pretty concerted time over the next few years trying to unpack how we ensure that Ann Arbor is a great place for current and future residents.
Yeah. Can you talk more about that? What is this, that kind of, I don't know, I know you're probably at the early stages of it, but what kind of planning or thinking, or what kind of impacts do you think that will be in terms of climate migration for Ann Arbor?
Sure. So let me frame it from this perspective. We are doing a really good job, I think, as an organization, always room for growth, but generally a good job at integrating projections of physical climate changes into our work. Our stormwater utility is thinking about how precipitation has changed and how it's projected to change as we're doing our modeling. Our water department is thinking about that, so that's great. But if we have more people in our system, even those best models will be wrong. So we've started to have conversations broadly, and you're seeing more and more research about climate migration, more in the popular press too. Water is life, and we happen to sit next to the largest source of fresh water in the world, right? And so it is my theory that people will move. I actually think they already have. I think we're probably in the second wave of climate migrants. I think the first wave are people like me who work in the field and who understand where long-term there's going to be opportunities and stability. And I think we're in the second wave, which are people who climate is but one factor in their thinking and they don't even know it. And they're saying things like, wow, it's really hot here and my family's from Michigan and the cost of living is lower. And you know what? We don't have to worry about water and it's starting to get really expensive. I think we're going to look at moving to Michigan, right? So they couldn't decipher that it's just climate. It is one of those variables, but it is one of those variables. I think it's already happening. Yeah. So we're having conversations to try to figure out, well, then what? How many people? And where do we think they'll go? And the answer is no one knows. So we're in an uncertain phase, but we're having the conversations to try to think about what that means and how we design systems to handle that uncertainty.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Well, and I think, just hearing you talk about it, this is also tied up in affordability, right? For like, if you're going to be a place of opportunity like Ann Arbor is, or, my former employer, the city of Durham, North Carolina, like if this is going to be a thriving place, like you also want to, create space for folks that might want to move here to be part of that thriving space. And so like how do you build a community and plan for a community that should attract residents, especially as the climate changes. That's really interesting.
Well, how do you also do that so you don't gentrify your community?
Yeah.
How do you make a welcoming community? Because people are going to come. The University of Michigan has the largest living alumni base. As I have been told, that is true. Maybe I'm wrong, but if that is true, and even if not, even if it's a second or fifth, that's a lot of people. So people know. Secret's out of the bag. We often win, best place to raise a family in America. People know. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of people know about Ann Arbor. So people are going to come. How do we make sure that those people coming can be received, but that we don't push out our existing Ann Arborites? Because we cannot plan. Well, I don't want to plan for a homogenous community.
Yeah.
Our strength is in our diversity of perspectives, of backgrounds, of diversity. That is the strength.
Yeah. No, well said. Well, that's, I think, as good of any other place to kind of wrap up. So my last question, which is the traditional last question on GovLove, is if you got to be the GovLove DJ and pick the exit music for this episode, what song would you pick?
Good Life by One Republic.
Nice. Okay. You had that ready to go. I'm impressed.
I did, because I was singing it in my head earlier today, and I was like, yeah, that seems right. Perfect.
So we'll get that queued up. And with that, that ends our episode for today. Dr. Stults, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me. This was awesome. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise and your experience.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
Awesome. And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders. And the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove or on Twitter with the handle @GovLovePodcast. And subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app. And if you're already subscribed, go tell a friend or colleague about this podcast. Help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.